I'm trying to help.
All right, guys. Thank you. Someday, again, I'll make the transition and it won't look terrible. That day is not today, but it's okay. Anyways, you guys, welcome. It's another Tuesday at noon Eastern, and it's Note to File Live. I'm actually really excited about today. I'm going to go ahead and start dragging people on here. First of all, my faithful co-host, Dr. Fox. How's it going?
Hey, Brad. Awesome music selection. Just trying to help.
Rock and roll. And drag up our other guest, Scott from MedVector. Scott, how's it going, my man?
Hey, guys. Can we leave that beat going?
Mm-hmm.
Like
I know, right?
We do this thing? That was good.
I tell people, that's my favorite part. I don't even really want to talk to you guys. I just like playing music, I always wanted to be a DJ, so.
Well, you've got the voice for it. Everybody agrees.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, very cool. Well, our topic today, DCT guidance, right? It's been out for a while, a lot of talk about it. Before we get there, though, Scott, I know you've been on the podcast before. So anybody listening, Scott's on episode 74, Note to File podcast. Make sure you go check that out. But if you would, for anyone who hasn't seen, introduce yourself, tell us a bit about MedVector and kind of what you guys are up to.
Sure. So my name is Scott Stout. I'm the CEO of MedVector. And MedVector is actually doing something interesting. So we're using decentralized tools to enable treating physicians to host clinical trial appointments from their practice without becoming an investigator or being on the 1572. And so the unique part about what we're doing has nothing to do with streamlining the protocol design or making a protocol easier to accomplish, or even making it potentially easier for patients to participate. While all of those are potentially true, what we're really doing is we're aligning the incentives between our referring physicians, our treating physicians and specialists, and our clinical trial sites. And by aligning those incentives, we're seeing referrals for the first time from our treating physicians. And Brad, you can attest to this. It's huge. By incorporating and including our treating physicians without asking them to do a whole bunch of extra work, they are providing us access to their patients. And this is how we speed up our clinical trial model, is by creating access to patients and incorporating our treating physicians.
Yeah. And, if you've worked at a site, and you probably had the experience, you've gone out, you've talked to local physicians, you've maybe even made some relationships. You want to get them, maybe they aren't investigators, but you want to get some referrals coming from them. It's very challenging for a number of reasons. And, one of those is that there's, not as much incentive, obviously. Doctors are afraid. I've heard it. People will act like I'm crazy, but I've legitimately had doctors be like, well, what if they get better, though? And they're not going to come back. They're not my patient anymore. Which sounds, terrible, but, it is what it is. These guys, they want to be a part of it. They enjoy their patients. They enjoy their patient care, and, they enjoy money. I mean, let's be perfectly frank. So, I'm a fan of what MedVector is doing. I'm a fan of the concept of, go ahead.
Brad, have you really heard that? Have you heard a physician say, I don't want my patient to get better?
Not exactly in those words, but I literally, not kidding, almost exactly the words, what happens if they get better and get treated and then they don't have to come back anymore, which I'm like, that's good, right? And intuitively you would think so. They haven't necessarily come out and said, I don't want my patients to get better. I think it's more that they're afraid they're going to lose their patient, as well as any income that could potentially come from that patient, to be perfectly honest.
We've seen that. And as far as, losing that patient relationship, and my perspective is actually the opposite from what I've seen. And I think the doctors kind of get a bad rap in that, they're them being greedy and money hungry. While revenue is also always a component of everyone's life, what we've seen is physicians are more concerned with, well, who's going to take care of the patient if I refer them to a different doctor? Because let's remember that when we're referring a patient to a clinical study, that's a single medication. It's not care.
Sure.
And so I think there's a lot of confusion that happens when we're asking physicians to refer and they go, well, who's taking care of the rest of the patient? Or
There's definitely education.
is that patient going to now think that this is my new doctor? And you can't tell it. And even if the site is like, no, look, we're not trying to poach patients. Well, the patient's going to make their own decision. They're going to say, well, but I want you to be my patient or my doctor now. And that is, where I see a risk. Not that I disagree with you. I think it's amazing that you've heard that.
Well, and we turn it the other way around too in rural areas. There's doctors around here who just don't want to be investigators, but patients don't have a choice to be part of trials, and unless they go like 5 hours away. So because the doctors make the professional decision not to be researchers, patients in entire communities can't have access to research in the old way. So
Right.
in the new way, what we could have is, and this is healthcare integration, full-fledged healthcare integration. Patients walk into their doctor's office just like a normal doctor visit, and they take part of care without having to travel 5 hours for a visit.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Dr. Longmire, well said. I mean, doctors, it's not the doctors necessarily don't want the patients. They want to keep them. They want them to get better. And, these systems don't want to use them. I've actually had this conversation with the system who said, these are our patients. And I'm like, well, what? I mean, the patient is free to see any doctor that they want to see. You do not own them. And to your point, obviously as they get away from, that physician managing them, you may be concerned about care gaps, which is, again, perfectly understandable. Again, this is why I'm a big fan. I'm probably going to give Scott a hard time on this podcast because that's what I do. And I think it's useful to have, these sorts of conversations, but I do very much think that MedVector solves this issue in a useful way. And we've used it, in full disclosure as well. So I like it, but I think there's still a lot of gaps in the DCT guidance. Now, interestingly enough, as I'm sure we'll see, I do think MedVector fills a lot of those gaps, not all of them, but I do think that, a fair amount of those gaps are addressed by, using MedVector. So anyways, we can structure this however you guys want. We kind of came in with no particular plan. I do have the guidance pulled up. If it's useful, we can sort of hit at least some of the points. So let me.
So I've got some direction and a
Sure.
statement that I'd like to make here. So I participated in several of these and to give my opinion on the guidance, and I think that the guidance is a huge step in the right direction. So just start off by saying that. What I hear a lot of is we need more clarity on X. And I think we should stop asking that because the ambiguity is actually good.
Well, and I'm slowly coming to the same conclusion. I think it's easy for sites to feel like they need and want that clarity, because if you stand back and look now at some of the things we do, they're insane. And in fact, I think a lot of it's due to ambiguity, and sometimes it's even just completely counter to direct guidance. Being asked to do all this extra crazy stuff. Now, previously and definitely early in my career, sites want to make everybody happy. They want to go with the flow. The problem is they will get absolutely buried and destroyed trying to do that.
Yeah.
Now, I think we're seeing a little change in the weather, right? We're seeing the wind start to blow a different direction, and sites are starting to, share better practices. They're starting to stand up and be like, hey man, why are we doing this? We don't have to do this. Let's all agree right now. We're not going to do it. And so, to your point, this may be a great transitionary period where, we can say, no, well, this is our interpretation of the guidance. Here it is. We can stand behind it. We can write a narrative around this guidance that fits, makes perfect sense, and we can. What's your
And it's not just sites though, right? So we've got sponsors that are terrified as well, right? And so while I think that the sites have almost the most risk on the table, because while a pharmaceutical company potentially could have the most cost on the table. A failed drug doesn't make them have to sell their house, right? So, whereas a site breaking the rules, potentially could lose their site. And so there is, some higher risk for the sites. And I think that the sites do need the guidance and the leadership from sponsors. And right now, and Brad, I've talked to you and Dr. Fox both about this, that pharma is an interesting animal, right? Because there's lots of smart people, but it is so risk adverse that the way that you excel working within a sponsor is by being the person who can identify the risks that nobody else saw. And that's how you protect your company, right? It's all about risk profile. Well, another way of saying that is the person who gets promoted is the one who's the best at saying no. So how do we get any innovation in this industry when everyone is trying to look for the smallest reason why it couldn't work?
Well, and that's honestly, that's the daily reality for a lot of sites. We have CRAs coming that are sponsor representatives, CRO representatives. We're getting, our asses handed to us over every tiny detail. So again, it's not hard to understand why sites are immediately like, up. This is concerning for us because, I know that if I have a stray mark on a piece of paper, someone's going to go, freak out to my PI about it. So to start to take these things further away from the clinic, obviously immediate concern, so to speak. So again, I'm with you in a very large degree. Probably I do play a lot of devil's advocate, in these conversations, because again, I know, and I've talked to sponsors and I've, tried different things. And I know that it can be challenging for sites. So I'm with you in theory right now. I think it is a good opportunity for, as Clara said, sites are asking for permission, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's time that, we don't need to ask for permission. We're independent contractors. We know how to follow guidance. We know how to read. I think that, Scott, you've used the term before, like, I can't remember. It's not
defensible position.
Defensible position. Very good. And I think if you've spent any time with a CRA or a monitor, you'll find that it's actually a lot easier than you think to kind of push them off their position. If you can pull up some guidance and have a defensible position to say, look, we can do this and here's why. Now, it doesn't work 100% of the time. Sometimes you still have to play the game a little bit.
In fact, that's what the FDA is looking for, right? So, and that's why they release a guidance and not regulations, right? They're not telling us how to do it because they want to leave room for innovation. It's intentionally ambiguous, right? Because they want to see operators build defensible positions, and then being able to back it with guidance, being able to back it with patient safety, be able to back it with why this is, helping efficacy. And based on that, right? If we take a step back, what does the FDA do? They're not the DMV, and we treat them like the DMV. They're really not trying to burden everybody with more documentation. It's all about efficacy, right? And data integrity is kind of a big component of how you get there, right? But
sure.
So if we take a step back and think about, all right, is what I'm doing in any way having implications to the data, patient safety? Is the testing units that I'm using, is it going to vary to a degree where it's, not going to show efficacy? So these are the things that the FDA wants us looking at. And if we create defensible positions, unfortunately, it feels like it's going to have to trickle up rather than trickle down. But it would be nice if we got some top-down support in making the decisions that we're making. Yeah,
and that may be the case. I think, to your point, I like the idea of it being bottom up. Although, I found a lot of instances where sites want to be the innovators, and then sponsors are not willing to take the chance or go out on a limb. And frankly, at the end of the day, to your point, like if a big sponsor shuts me out, or maybe more accurately, a big CRO, like I could be screwed, as a research site, 'cause that's all I got. I can't turn around and, do something else. I mean, all we do our clinical trials. So I do think there still will continue to be some, risk aversion from the site side, but unfortunately, I think a lot of that's stifled by the sponsors themselves. Some of the ones who are, even speaking up and saying they want these things, but then when they're sort of confronted with them, it's sort of a different story.
So I got a question for both of you guys. How much more quickly do you think that you could enroll your studies if you had full cooperation from sponsors?
More quickly. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that.
We're talking years faster?
Yeah, you define full cooperation.
Well, the full cooperation meaning if the industry at large got out of its own way, right, and did right by the patient and used new technologies, and we could snap our fingers and start using DCT across the board, right? Not cheating, not making any leaps, but if we just followed the appropriate path, the safety procedures that we all know are there, right? So like if we did that, do we think that the average time to market for new medications would still be 10 to 14 years? Or do we think?
No, I mean, I think it could be significantly faster. I think especially if you want to get crazy with it, you're talking about, sites
admin
appropriately and on time.
All the admin and the contract and timelines and all.
Along with that, I think that would make a huge impact. I mean, there's no question about that. And again, look, sites know what to do. They've done this. They're not doing it because they don't know how to do it. And not every site is, world class, but, again, they've been around, they've been through this. I think they generally know what the hell they're doing. So to back away and give them a little bit of space, I think would be huge for the industry. Now, the flip side of that though is I think you're going to see, and not to get, I don't want to get personal, but like you talk about care access in situations like this, where they were sort of taking some advantage, not in a negative way, but taking advantage of new ideas, new models, the new ways of doing things. And, obviously I don't know the details, but created enough of a problem that it was, a huge impact on them. Now, I don't know what their future holds. I don't know much about them, period. But those sorts of things, maybe should we just expect that this may be some of the missteps that are made along the way? Or is that going to sort of reaffirm the risk aversion that, we already see?
I was thinking about that actually this morning, and let's pretend that we've got 10 protocols sitting in front of us, right? If we continue on the current path for these 10 protocols, we're looking at 10 to 14 years till they get to market, right? But if we start making changes, I'm not even talking about a huge leap. I'm saying if we start making changes, we shave off so much time of all of these protocols, maybe 2 of them get kicked back. So now we have 8 successful FDA approved protocols that you're now generating revenue from, instead of being scared on all 10, right? Doesn't this make sense that we should push the ball forward? And yes, there will be mistakes that are made, but in actuality, it's not the worst thing that can happen, but if it gets kicked back, well, then you do your clinical trial again. I know that nobody wants to do that, but if you've got 8 that are now approved and generating revenue and 2 that get kicked back that you just have to do again, you potentially could still fall in that 10 to 14 year category, even doing it twice with the proper patient tools.
Like high risk, high reward. You're going to have progression, you're going to have advancement, you're going to have some eggs to crack on the way. And maybe
the problem is nobody in ClinOps wants one of the failures to be in their column.
Exactly. So there's the risk right there.
And that's one of the problems is ClinOps they're responsible for their study. So everyone's risk averse. And we also have, and I've talked to both of you guys about this, is the industry is kind of has permission to fail, right? So as long as you kind of stay inside your tidy box and follow the rules, you'll get a pat on the back when your study fails, because clinical trials are hard, right? So you have permission to fail when you stay inside the box. The second you stick your neck out, oh, well, maybe that's the reason that the study failed.
Mhm.
And so everyone is just stuffed inside their little box, which is why the diversity push has been really good for the industry, because now it's forcing everybody to kind of take that baby step outside the box and at least have a plan.
So I think it's okay. I'd like to get back on track here. I'm seeing some wonderful questions to address. And Scott, actually, you've got a request to be Professor Scott, be a teacher of defensible position over here. We've been through this guidance, the letters, and just as a disclaimer, I'm on a number of public policy committees. We're going to be writing letters to the FDA about this guidance. We've been through it. From your initial review, Scott, and from the other things that you've been through, can you walk through how MedVector aligns with this guidance? And like devil's advocate, what are you worried about from this guidance as far as MedVector goes?
Sure. So the biggest place that I think that we align, and by the way, let me answer that question as far as Professor Scott. MedVector creates the defensible position for the sites that we work with. So we call it the defensibility playbook. So we leave it with sites, and so if there is a CRA or monitor that comes in and questions something that we're doing that has regard to MedVector, we have all of those kind of in a single location that you can open up. So we are doing that. Now, as far as the guidance is concerned, I love that the FDA is completely been clear on the 1572. They want us to stop using that as a catch-all for compliance. And that's what we've been doing. Any question, just put it on the 1572. The FDA doesn't want that. In the same way that the FDA doesn't want paper records. Sponsors are still saying, but the FDA God loves paper records. They don't. They're a pain in the ass. So we need to stop doing that. So there's a piece in the guidance that says that healthcare practitioners, if they're doing standard of care acts, they don't need to be on the 1572. Now we're all caught up in what is standard of care and what isn't standard care and what is protocol specific. And this is one of the places we need to get out of our way, right? So standard of care is, are you a phlebotomist? You know how to draw blood. Great. That's standard of care, right? Are you an x-ray tech? You know how to take an x-ray. You're licensed to use that equipment. That's standard of care. Just because the protocol says the protocol requires an x-ray of the left shoulder, that doesn't mean it's a protocol specific activity.
Yeah, that varies certainly, but yes, I mean, I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Okay,
There,
but what
there,
if
are,
the
there are
protocol?
specific protocols within those protocols at times, not always, but
There
even
are,
then, to your point, even now, that's being applied very haphazardly, and we see it. Like some studies are like, yes, train them, put them on the delegation log. Some are saying, no, don't worry, it is part of their standard of care. So we already see that happen a little bit. I think, again, there's frustration for sites is like it's so unevenly applied.
Well, so Dr. Fox and I were talking about the DOA and the new layer that the guidance is put in called the task log, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I actually love this. So and I have it clear in my head. Whether or not everyone else feels the same as me, we will find out. But I believe that what the FDA has done is they've done 3 layers of audit trail based on the significance of what's actually happening within the protocol and how much you've stepped away from doing it to delegating it, right? So let's refer to using a telemedicine appointment, okay? Asking somebody to collect blood during a telemedicine visit is not a delegation. So the way that I'm defining delegation, and if you look it up in the dictionary, delegation has to do with asking somebody else to do something for you blindly, right? And so it's the blindly part that I am standing behind. So when you're asking somebody to do something blindly, so at your convenience, could you do X, Y, Z? That would be a delegation. Asking you to take the height and weight of a patient while I'm on a telemedicine visit is not a delegation. And the way that we can identify the difference is with source data. So has source data been created at a different or new location? If the answer is yes, then it has been delegated. So how do we say that source data isn't created when the patient is at a different location? Right? So this is something I find very interesting that nobody's talking about. So before telemedicine, data collection and data entry couldn't be separated. Right? Patient had to walk in somewhere, had to be measured, and then that had to be either entered somewhere or written down. And that is your source. Right? So that is source data. Well, telemedicine has done something interesting, right? So it enables a patient to be in two places at the same time, right? So let's stop talking about where is the patient. The patient can be physically at their provider's office and virtually at a clinical trial site. So if this is a live telemedicine appointment, the patient can be measured here and data can be entered here simultaneously, which means that we have not changed the source data, which means that the source data is being entered by an originator exactly the same way at a clinical trial site, just the same as if a patient had walked into the room.
Well, I will say this, something interesting about the guidance that maybe I'm breaking the rules. I'm asking for more clarification, but it doesn't. So I'm with you. I actually think that if you include a telehealth component, it actually kind of does away with at least a good chunk of the potential issues I may have, because I know someone that is trained on the protocols overseeing what's going on, because you start to have questions, right? If you just ship a patient and say, go see your local HCP, he's on our task log, go see him, he'll do a physical exam, whatever.
Blinded? If it's done blind, that would be on the DOA. If it's done live,
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure that distinction's made. He's still, and to your point, I don't think you're wrong, but I don't know that distinction is well elucidated in the guidance. It doesn't seem to connect telemedicine and HCP. It almost addresses them as two different ways to accomplish something. And again, maybe
DCT was a term created by us, not the FDA, right?
Sure.
So this language exists before it's given clarity. So this is our job. We need to come together as an industry and say the task log needs to be an internal audit log that is housed at clinical trial sites, which is just for audit purposes of someone did something, right? And so a phlebotomist drew blood at an alternative location. That would be on the task log. But that task log isn't something that's submitted to the FDA. It's there for audit purposes, if necessary, housed at the site. Then the next layer, right, is the DOA. We asked somebody to do something blindly, which created source data somewhere else. That's the DOA. So sure. I asked them to do a physical and then send me the results. DOA.
So, Scott, question.
Yeah.
And this has come up in a few of the policy committees. Do you think that the task log will comprise individuals or organizations?
Individuals.
So every person who is tasked with something has to be on there.
Yes. In my interpretation, and I think that that's necessary because we don't want to just say the patient got blood, right? So I think that there's potentially situations where it would be a location, like if you sent a patient to LabCorp, I don't know that you actually need the phlebotomist's name on your task log. But
you're not going to get the same one every time anyway. So.
Well, and you're pretty much, I think what you're looking at is, if you were looking at ISO standards, you're looking at approved vendor lists is what's happening.
Well, I hope not. Right. Because then that's another layer of complication that potentially doesn't need to be there. Right.
Well, and that's why we're talking about these things. That's the fear for us too, because I mean, look, it takes two to tango, right? And
can you imagine how messy that's going to be on a task log to collect everyone's identity at these places?
Because that's not that big a deal. We'll do it. MedVector does it, right? So
Well, I also think though you're going to be, and again, maybe I'm thinking small, but like any one site is going to be somewhat limited. I mean, I can't work with 50 locations on a task log, right? Just because I'm literally logistically incapable of doing that.
but you couldn't
Because
manage live telemedicine at 50 locations anyway.
well, that's what I'm saying. It's going to be somewhat self-limited to maybe the most appropriate places for each particular protocol.
Yep.
So, which is good. That's a good thing. And I do think that will make it slightly more manageable. I mean, I do think, guidance aside, logistics is a whole nother question for sites and how they're able to manage this. And, again, there's the devil's in the details. Even the way you're describing it, I'm perfectly fine accepting the premise, but you're still going to have things like, well, okay, they can draw blood as phlebotomists, but can they process blood? Because that's now specific to the study itself. Every study protocol has different processing. So do I need to go pick up the blood? If so, that's fine. But again, now you're getting in the weeds with a lot of the logistics and how sites are basically managing more sites, which again, perfectly fine. But I think that does create a self-limiting role for a certain amount of HCPs. Now, again, not that is a bad thing.
I understand your concept and concern of sites managing more sites, but we got to stop calling them sites, right? So these alternative locations are not sites, and the kind of the way that MedVector defines it is a site is where the data is housed, right? So it is where the source data is entered. That is a site. There's obviously, exceptions to the rule, but the auditable location is the site. And so if we have somebody doing a blood draw or getting an MRI at an alternative location, we don't necessarily want that to be a site because there's nothing really to audit there, right?
So definition semantics aside, I think what Brad was saying is it's literally just enhancing, or it's taxing the bandwidth of the sites to manage more things.
Sure, but don't you want to do that?
I was going to say,
you want more patients?
yes. Again, and I'm saying I think sites are willing to take that on. But
Yeah.
I mean, again, though, I think it's going to have to be this is why details I think are important because guidance is good, but ultimately each site's going to have to really think very hard and be very strategic, I think, in how they do that. And to speak to your point, Mario's thrown up a question.
Mario's been burning this question, man. He wants to know.
Because whether we call it a site or a location or a whatever we want to call it, the real fact of the matter is investigators are responsible for the conduct, right? So I'm a little bit. I almost want to call it a site because I feel like I'm accountable for managing that as part of the investigator team, and I think you want that, right? You want that coordination with the home site, so to speak. So maybe that's a rhetorical thing that I can get over, but this all still falls under investigator oversight regardless. So let me ask you this: do you think that has it been a mistake in the way that DCT has been sort of pitched so far? Like, shouldn't we be talking to sites and getting sites on board rather than I feel like historically, and again, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but a lot of these conversations have been happening amongst vendors and higher level, and it's sort of being spoken to above sites' heads in a lot of ways. Or maybe I just feel that way as a site. Is it time? Do we need to get sites on board if we ever have any hope of adoption? Because again, ultimately, it's their asses on the line when the FDA comes knocking on your door.
And do you know who was part of this, Scott? Who was part of the whole guidance thing? Were there sites on this committee?
No, I don't know. I couldn't comment on that, but I will say that I think that the most important first step, going back to DCT as a vocabulary word, right? The industry created that collectively before the FDA wrote it, and so that's what we need to do, right? We need to start using the same vocabulary. We need to stop saying site when it's an alternative location. We need to stop referring to a healthcare practitioner as somebody who's approved by the study, right? They're not. We are just asking somebody to do a job that they're licensed and capable of doing under the direct supervision of the investigator team. So I think another place is we need to stop muddling investigator with investigator team, because sometimes it's a coordinator, right? It's not the investigator. While the investigator is still responsible for the oversight, that doesn't mean that they are physically supervising it. And so these are we have to get specific with our own vocabulary as an industry, and that will create its own clarity, especially if we're not violating patient safety and efficacy.
Yeah. Well, and again, to your point, even now, a CRC doing a visit, the investigator's not standing over my shoulder watching me do the visit, right? He's delegated me to do take on that role.
And you are on the log.
Right. Yeah. And look, again, verbiage and jargon aside, I mean, I don't think we're saying different things necessarily, although we may be saying them differently. I think that's going to take some time to really hash out, especially some of this stuff is so ingrained, unfortunately. So no, I don't necessarily disagree. And look, I also want to say this, believe it or not, you're probably talking to some of the most progressive site level people. I know I come off very negatively, but I think people who know and have had are willing to engage will know that we want this stuff. I want this stuff. I want to be able to go help more people. I want to be able to work. I want to be able to work more efficiently. And I think sites that,
Brad, so how do we change this? What do people need to do to be more like you?
Get a lower voice.
I'm not grow a beard.
Grow a beard.
I mean, well, and here's the thing, though. I think we have to, and this is going to take time, but I think clarity, this is why I think clarity is so being asked for, because I think that's what sites feel like they need. And I don't know how easy that will be to overcome until some of us start doing the damn thing. Mm-hmm. And frankly,
exactly. So going back to my question, Scott, I want to know what you know. What, as a MedVector rep, what are you worried about the most from this guidance, this draft?
The question I don't want to answer. You're really pulling it out of me. All right. So I do have a concern with the guidance. The guidance seems to be pointing more toward protocol design, saying that and it's workable because there is enough ambiguity that we potentially could get through it. But there are many instances where it says that the protocol needs to be specific as to what is applicable and what isn't applicable for each visit. I would prefer it if the protocol would call out when it is not appropriate rather than dictating what is appropriate. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would even go a step further and say that it's at the discretion of the investigator, like so many things are. Yeah. Now, obviously, some things are not appropriate, but frankly, you are relying on the expertise and decision making of the investigator team, however you want to refer to it. And so many things that we do come down to that. They come down to you go ask a question. It's at the discretion of the investigator. Okay, great, and that's fine. But that's where I think we should be able to have some latitude, right, at the discretion. So I'm with you. I was actually disappointed to see that it's so tied to protocol specifics, because ultimately we're held hostage by what the sponsors are willing to write into their protocols at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
And that can be very very frustrating.
If the protocols now become more exclusive.
Yeah. Then you're pretty much just going to make a bunch of DCT protocols.
Yeah.
And I really did not like, there were a number of references where it talked about how the sponsor and the investigator combined would be coordinating the trial. And that was really concerning for me. Having statements in there about sponsors running the trials.
Yeah.
There were 3 of them in particular, talking about like the third-party vendors, the things like that. But any association with a sponsor themselves running the trial, that it kind of hit some ethical nerves for me.
I could see that. I do want to pull this up here. New physicians being, liability averse. Is this going to potentially scare away more physicians into participating in trials? And I do have 2 sorts of thoughts about this. One is that, frankly, we this may solve an issue, and that we may not need as many investigators. Not that that's something I'm championing by any means. I think more should be involved, but this is why I think we kind of need to have our stuff together when we do roll these out, because I'll be really honest. I mean, generally the investigator's willingness to participate has a lot to do with how well their team manages things for them. Because I mean, the investigators aren't,
good work on vocabulary there as well.
Well, the investigators aren't, let's be honest, they're not doing a lot of the hard work. I don't mean, they're doing their own hard work in a different realm, right? They're doing patient care, they're saving lives, they're doing all the amazing things they do. This is not a shot against doctors.
A lot of it is delegated to the investigator team.
Correct. And this is where I think you're going to need real sharp teams, frankly. And this is why I beat these conversations up the way I do, because if I fail with an investigator, a new investigator, they're a lot less likely to participate. So if I screw up, I don't want to scare off somebody from participating, which is why I'd hate running too blindly into anything. So I think that all kind of ties together in a circle. Yeah, it could. A new physician could look at this, or a new PI, and say, how am I supposed to keep up with all this stuff? I mean, the true answer is you really don't. Your team is helping you manage this.
Yeah, you scale your team appropriately to keep up, and you provide the appropriate oversight.
Correct.
But you don't have to be in the day-to-day. Now, from the opposite side of it, though, right? So this new referring physician at an alternative location, well, this is huge. We're no longer asking them to do protocol training, right? We're no longer asking them to jump through hoops, or being an audible location, or become a site, or hire anybody. We're simply saying, give us access to your patients, and let them participate from your office, so you potentially get the credit when everything works out great and they're feeling better.
Well, and frankly, the irony is I think this may actually get more of these local healthcare providers interested in being investigative sites. And, to be honest, some of them may be more appropriate depending on the different protocols and patient populations. But this is where I love it, because it helps us create positive, aligned relationships with local healthcare providers, aside from just, involvement in that one trial. In which case, pretty soon you've got a hub and they're your spoke. Well, pretty soon they're a hub and you got more spokes off of that hub. And then you become really almost exponential in the way that you can grow and include more patients across more practices. So, I do think it could actually help people become more interested and more willing to participate, because they're going to start getting familiarity with the process.
Yeah, research isn't going to be a mystery, something behind a veil that's meant for guinea pigs. It's going to be healthcare integration. It's going to be a part of the practice.
Clinical trials as a care option.
No?
Okay, that's another podcast.
No. But clinical trials as a health management opportunity, maybe.
Yeah, that's beyond.
We're back to semantics.
I have my own. Yeah, that's a whole long deal. Yeah. But no, I get what you're saying though.
Yeah.
It's
not gonna be a mystery.
It's more integrated and more accessible, regardless of however you want to stamp a acronym on the top of it.
As an industry, we talk about clinical trial candidates being hard to find, right? And they're not.
They're there.
They're not. There's somebody in pharma who has done the analysis to see if there's demand for the product that they're making. That demand is there, or they wouldn't be spending hundreds of millions of dollars to prove efficacy of a new molecule. So the patients are there. We just don't have access to them. And it's so often, you guys have heard me say this, I say that patient access is a two-way street, right? So we've got access for patients, but then also access to patients, right? And everyone's so focused on access for patients. How do we make it easier for patients to participate? That nobody's talking about the access to patients. How would that patient know that they needed access to a study in the first place, right? And advertising for clinical trials is challenging. recruiting is challenging, access to patients is challenging. So how do we do that? How do we solve that? And I think that the real opportunity that we have is engaging our treating physicians and making it easy for them to participate. So yes, it's going to create a little bit more burden on the sites. It's going to create a little bit more necessary oversight for our PIs. But the goal of this whole thing is to advance medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we do it. This is how we do it. And so we are on the right path. And so we need to come together. We need to define what this guidance says rather than asking for clarity. Let's do it.
Well, and yeah, to your point, I don't want there to be a misconception that, at least, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I'm not against DCT. I'm not against getting access to more patients. That's the whole damn reason I started doing what I do, is so that I can get to more patients and provide more opportunities for people. I do think, again, the issue, we beat it to death already, but clarity or not, it's that, like, look, I know that every 2 weeks, at least, I have a monitor here with a stack of sticky notes. I'm getting beat up over everything. Now I want to throw more onto the mix. How do sites balance that? And that's where, again, I would love to see the site community start to come together and talk through the logistics and like best practices, and maybe in conjunction with, the leaders in the DCT space. And that's really where I've been, is it's still sort of fragmented, and we're having different conversations in sort of different worlds. You know what I mean? And ultimately, again, we're going to carry this out. We got to be the ones to do it. Mm-hmm. No amount of rhetoric or navel gazing is going to solve the problem for a site. So I want us to be just very involved. And some of that's going to be challenging, some of the assumptions, that are there from both sides. I think that's healthy. I think that's what we should be doing. I would love to see more from the other side, challenging sites. I know we're loud and, we're jerks about it sometimes, but I think it's because, we want to do it right. Mm-hmm. And we want to do it in a way that, does get us to the goal of actually making this more accessible without, creating more problems. I mean, we already know the clinical trial process is basically chaos, right? I tell people all the time, like, anytime anyone agrees to be in a trial and they stay in it, I'm like, I'm shocked, because it's very chaotic. Tech's not good. I worry about, well, now we're spinning that out to people, even more people. Again, I think that'll get better over time. But again, I think it's just a certain level of just caution, from sites who don't feel like they've yet been explained how this is going to work, and, are sure that it's going to be a value add versus a burden add.
It really hit me hard what Mary Costello said right there. She said she likes to think of it as more of a need rather than a demand. And I agree. It kind of goes back to what Scott was saying, where the patients are there. I get calls all the time. People in the Midwest die from things that research could have helped because they don't have access to the infrastructure. The infrastructure just isn't there. So that's one thing to consider. And I like what Brad said. It kind of brings to I think the sites that crack this code, the sites that successfully activate this technology, will be the champions of the future. I really do.
Well, and again, I want people to realize that's why, like, I'm out here kicking the tires, not because I hate it, because I want to see, like, how am I going to utilize this, and I'll do it in a way that I'm not going to, have to lay off the people who work for me because I screwed up, So I'm kicking the tires, man. I'm taking this thing for a test drive. I want to put it through its paces, and I want to hear and feel confident, like, in the movements that we make going forward. And, again, there's still, I know we're running out of time, but I mean, there's still already a lot of other, like, roads to go down in terms of getting in the weeds, and I know it sucks and a lot of people don't want to do it, but I think we're going to have to get in the weeds. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to, or, maybe we just shut up and do it ourselves, and, everyone can learn from us. I don't know.
Yep. Count me in. I'll do it.
So we'll be 3 steps ahead.
Do you guys want to jump on Clara's question here about trial related activities?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Another big moment in the
I think this is a
Draft.
real confusion point for a lot of people. And just because something's written in the protocol doesn't necessarily mean it's a trial related activity. I think what we're referring to, so for example, asking a nurse to draw blood, while that is something that the protocol requires, that is not a trial related activity that requires training. So same with height and weight, right? Sometimes blood pressure. If blood pressure is a key endpoint for any study, we're not going to be asking anybody to do it the old-fashioned way. The sponsor is going to be sending automated blood pressure cuffs, and they're going to ask everybody to use the same make and model. So when there is protocol-specific training that has nothing to do with your license, that's when I think that we get into this gray area of who's allowed to do what. But if your license allows you to do it already, like drawing blood and you're a phlebotomist, that's standard of care.
Yeah. Again, so I think, and this is interesting too, I think there's an opportunity here to challenge more of the status quo through this guidance. So again, I do, to your point, I see this as potentially a good thing. Cause we think about if you're drawing blood for a trial, they're asking you for a IATA training maybe, right? Which, do we really need that in the first place? And they talk about device calibration, even for things that aren't endpoints. I mean, they're here looking at every sticker on every freaking thing in my office, every year. Now, is that necessary, or do we not have to do that in these alternate locations? I can see an argument, either way, depending on how you view it. But again, I think that's a thing that needs to be we need some kind of consensus there. No, I mean, am I wrong?
So Scott, what about order of operations that are protocol specific? Like having to draw blood before or after fasting, or taking blood pressure before or after another event. There's a lot of very specific protocol related things that are built around standard of care actions.
Well, so let's not overthink it, right? So if the patient was coming into the site physically, right, and you're going to be drawing blood, are you going to remind them to fast then, or are you going to call them beforehand?
So maybe not the blood draw one, but blood pressure in particular. There's a lot of blood pressure specific order of operations. Like you must take blood pressure before an EKG, or you must do an EKG before this, or something like that, specific to the protocol. But
so again, so this is where delegation falls in, right? So if you're doing it blind, then potentially there's training involved because you're delegating a task because it's happening without your oversight, quite literally. Without your oversight. But if it's a telemedicine appointment, well, the coordinator is going to be dictating the order of operations, just like the patient was in the room.
So the coordinator would be on the DOA, but whoever's in the room with the patient could be on the task log, and therefore would not require that training.
Bingo, you got it.
Yeah, and that's where again to go back to the beginning. I do think telemedicine makes this a lot less vague and a lot easier to manage. So, I think that, again, if you want to sort of make it a little simpler, easier on yourself, the telemedicine angle solves a lot of those, because otherwise you're relying on them to do something without your direct eyes on it, which I don't think a lot of sites are going to be as comfortable with. I mean, hell, it's hard to get things done in your own clinic and your own system sometimes. So relying on another, I think, is a bridge too far for many. But
sure,
if you got eyes on it, it's hard to argue. I mean, it's hard to argue that that's not a lot more, palatable for
and so
the team.
Where everybody's mind goes with telemedicine again it's remember, patient access is that two-way street. We've got access for patients and access to patients. So when we think about telemedicine, a lot of us jump to the side of the street that's access for patients. Oh, we've found a patient and it's too hard for them to get to the clinical trial site. They live 2 hours away, so they're not going to do it. Let's use telemedicine, right? That's where everybody's head goes. And so people are like, well, why would I use telemedicine if the patient is local? Well, the reason that we should be using telemedicine is we should be incentivizing patients to participate from their provider's office.
Yep.
Because that's where the real relationship exists. People don't bail on a specialist that saved their life. I wouldn't. I have
No,
one.
Yeah. No, and this is I mean, I think it's really important that you acknowledge that. I think anyone who works at a site knows this intuitively, that the best and most engaged patients are the ones that, have that relationship with the
Our
physician.
patients
And
of the PI. Yep.
so I do love that, we're not taking that away. And in fact, again, I've said this too from the beginning. I think the technology that will succeed is that which helps strengthen relationships, not takes patients out of their relationships. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's easy for people to sign up online, download an app, and I think I don't think that's going to be nearly as successful as keeping patients in their trusted physician offices.
And so let's talk about that as far as the distance gap and why telemedicine is potentially so important. So what we can do by utilizing alternative locations and aligning the incentives between the referring physicians and investigator teams is we can unlock access to the patients that are literally across the hallway from the clinical trial site, from that doctor who currently isn't referring.
Yeah.
That's where this is huge. It's not about creating access for patients that are too far away. This is about creating access to the patients that are already in the backyard of your clinical trial sites. And so this is where it gets ultimately even more interesting, because let's not overthink the logistics, right? So, now we have an automated blood pressure cuff that needs to be used for this patient to collect this data. How am I getting the automatic blood pressure cuff to the provider office? Walk it across the hallway.
Yeah, just take it over there.
Take it, right? What the specialist office doesn't have the blood processing facility. They don't have a centrifuge, so we can't do it. Why not? Go pick up the blood. Then the answer to the question we get after that is, well, why wouldn't the patient then just go to the site? Because then we're not incentivizing the treating physician and making them feel that they're maintaining that patient relationship. So we should be doing as many appointments as possible for the patient's sake, for the referring physician's sake, from the treating physician office or a long-term care facility.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brad.
No, I think that's a great point, and something that is even lost on me sometimes is not, keep it simple. We don't need to be, I don't need to see patients in, Kansas. I can see a patient down the road, or across the street, or I'm in a huge hospital system. It makes a lot of sense to implement something like this. There's already institutional incentive, but they get to stay with their doctor. There gets to be there's a little extra scratch in it for these doctors. Let's not kid ourselves. That's going to help a little bit too.
So let's think about implementing this in a major healthcare system, right? So let's just call out Stanford. Everybody knows Stanford, right? So if we have one doctor in Stanford running a clinical study, that does not mean that all of the doctors at Stanford are running that study. It means one doctor is. And so even if Stanford gave MedVector access to all of the patient data and we could mine that looking for candidates, we still don't have access to those patients because they're all siloed behind a treating physician that says, do not call my patients, right? So using telemedicine, companies like MedVector, to enable cross-referring within a healthcare system, now essentially every provider within Stanford could be offering every clinical trial that any doctor at Stanford is running. This is good for Stanford. This is good for the treating physicians because now they have access to alternative care options. This is good for the investigator teams because now they're drawing more patients. This is good for everyone.
Well, and I think this is one of the missing pieces. There's a lot of talk, and this is not new, but the EMR scrubbing and AI to identify patients in EMR, that's cool. But to your point, if you can't get to the patient, who cares? All I got is a list of people that I can't talk to, or a list of people that I can't get to. And I think that's been an issue with some of these, depending on what your site setup is. So I just feel like this is that missing piece to tie it all together, because now you can get to the patient without pulling the patient away, and you can do it with the buy-in of that treating physician. So no, I'm with you. I mean, I think it's good. Again, I think it's you're still going to see baby steps and even one step forward and two steps back, probably from sites. But I mean, I think we're on the right path here, man. I think we're onto something.
I was just going to say that there's one line in this guidance that I think is really important for every site to hear. On all these policy committees, the questions are coming up and it's, well, how do I do this? What's my process for that? What about my calibrations? And I really like how the FDA just said, you know what? Figure it out. This is going to be on you, the site, to figure it out. We can't tell an entire industry how to write their processes.
There might be data variations.
A hospital versus a private clinic versus.
Yes.
So it just said you may have to write your own SOPs. Figure it out.
Again, to all this point, like, look, people like us, we're small, we're agile, we're forward thinking. Yeah. This is a huge advantage for small sites. And, I think there was a time when DCT and things like that were maybe a threat to sites, especially small sites. But I think if you turn that around, it's actually a huge opportunity. I can make things happen way faster than Stanford. No offense to Stanford individually and particularly, but
that's why we love you, Brad.
But we can do these things. Again, it comes with its own challenges that are logistic in nature. But if you're a small site, I think it behooves you to get out in front of this. Then be a leader. I mean, we can establish some pretty big networks long before these guys, with a bunch of money and a bunch of bureaucracy and boards that won't let them do anything. So I think there's some really, really interesting opportunities here.
So for the sites that are out there that are listening, there is a really strange catch-22 because at MedVector, we talked to both sides. We talked to a lot of sites. We talked to a lot of sponsors. We talked to a lot of CROs. The sponsors and CROs are terrified of you. You have more power than you think you do. Yep. In the same way that the sites are afraid of biting the hand that feeds them, the sponsors are terrified of rocking the boat of an investigative team.
Yep. I could tell you, and CRPN is growing, and that's becoming far stronger. The bigger CRPN is getting,
more weight than you think.
Yeah.
So as an industry, we have the opportunity here to be front and stage and lead, and the sponsors will follow, especially once they start seeing how much
the results
is increasing.
Yeah.
And especially with companies like MedVector, where we're not altering the source data at all. So you can't tell a difference between a walk-in participant versus a virtual participant. This is what the task log is for, right? So you can't tell the difference between those two when it's submitted to the FDA. So the FDA loves this, right? This is what they're asking for. They're literally begging and saying, please use our guidance to create defensible positions to help the industry.
So we've gone over. Let's tie this up in a little bow here at the end. So what can sites do? What can sites do now? Obviously, this guidance isn't live. There probably, I'm sure there'll be some changes. You could argue that some of this stuff could still be implemented even prior to official guidance. It doesn't necessarily go against any current guidance per se. But all that being said, what can sites do now, or what can they start doing now to prepare for this?
I have an idea, but you go first, Scott.
Call MedVector.
The number one thing that all of you sites can do right now is draft that SOP for DCT visits. Get that in your SOPs right away. You can adjust it when the FDA has the full guidance published, but DCT is coming. If you don't even have it acknowledged in your SOP manual, you've got to get ahead of that.
That is a great point. It is. Dr. Fox has a really, really, really good point, because putting things to paper helps answer all of those internal kind of fuzziness questions. And Dr. Fox, I know you've done it before. Would you be willing to help people with their SOPs?
I have done it before, yes. And just a prediction, I can
He's
see in
good.
the future with your feasibility and your PSSVs, your monitor is going to ask you for your DCT protocol, your DCT SOP. It's going to be just like, show me your informed consent protocol. It's going to say, show me your DCT protocol. So the very first thing that you need to do right now is acknowledge DCT is coming and get that protocol in your SOP manual.
Yep.
All right. I like it, guys. Any last words?
Great
No,
job,
said it all.
Scott.
I
Said
think
it all.
this is good. Yeah. And, once again, we try to make a, disruptive conversation. We're all on the same page.
I think it worked out okay.
Yeah. Again, I still think there's more probably to be talked about. And again, this is how I sort of work through it. This is my like pre-work, right? Is like talking this through with people, thinking through the logistics before I get anything on paper, hearing different points of view. For me, this is like my research, right? Before, I start getting stuff on paper. So I love having these conversations. Ultimately, I do think by and large, the industry is on the same page. Now, methods and semantics are, maybe, they want to be. They want to be. Again, sites are their own weird animal. There's no question about that. So, they may take a little bit longer, but to that point, that's going to create an opportunity for a lot of us. So there's a real opportunity here to be trailblazers and to make things happen, to have a big change on the industry that we want to see. So I'm with Fox. I think we need to get out in front of it.
Yep. And I do. So I know we have to leave, but Michael's question, so Michael, just so you know, like we talked about this, man, every site's SOP is going to be different. It's going to be hard to share any one SOP that's going to work. You're going to have to.
Dr. Fox, why don't you drop your email in the chat?
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, I do think to that point, though, is this it, Fox?
Is that the one you want?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's taking reach out to Dr. Fox. I do think, to Michael's point, and, I do think it's not bad for us to have some, at least, again, having some consensus or, again, sharing those best practices. Yes, we'll have our own SOPs. We'll have our own way of doing this and have our own defensible positions, but I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility. I think it's a good idea if we can at least have some pillars, if that makes sense, that we're all like, okay, here's some pillars we can all agree upon. How you execute that is, kind of up to you. But otherwise, let's start agreeing on some, basic things and moving forward from there. So yeah, a baseline template. Yeah, I think, again, doesn't need to be anything, nuts, because again, you're going to do your thing. I'm going to do mine. But I think there's a long way we could go towards, if we talk it through, show everybody like, look, yeah, we can do this. We can agree on these things and move from there. So I love that idea. Much more to come, guys. We went, 15 minutes over. We could probably go for another hour if we really wanted to, but Scott, I appreciate you coming on, man. Any, give a last plug for MedVector before we sign off?
Not for MedVector, but just like encouragement, like moving the ball forward is actually right now holds less risk than leaving things the way they are. So we are so in our own way that we're, worried about checking the right boxes on protocols rather than what the FDA cares about, right? So it's efficacy and patient safety. So let's move the ball forward. This isn't something where it's like, hey, we all want to make more money. This is, let's help people, right? Like as an industry, we are on the verge of a medical revolution similar to the Industrial Revolution. If we get out of our way with AI technologies, with gene sequencing, with all of these things, clinical trials today aren't what they used to be. It's not like, hey, I've got this idea. I wonder what'll happen in humans. We're now proving what the machines are telling us, and we're pretty close, right? So there's some side effects that we didn't know, but for the most part, efficacy is there for the majority of studies. So we are on the verge of knocking the cover off the ball. So my question to the sites out there, you want to be one of the big ones, or do you want to be a dinosaur and go away? So now's the time.
I like it. Dr. Fox, anything before we sign off?
I do believe that MedVector will be a key to healthcare integration on the logistics level, and I look forward to seeing what they are doing when this guidance comes out in full.
All right, guys. Tune in next week. We'll have another great show. Appreciate all everyone's comments and a really cool conversation. Again, we could probably do some more of these, kind of drill down on some different topics, but let's keep the conversation going. And thanks, guys.